In April 1993, followers of David Koresh were wiped out in a horrifying massacre at Waco, Texas. 2 years later, approaching the anniversary of that fiery death, enraged Americans, populists, many of your friends, the people you call on telephone, were being pumped up by the British as they approached the anniversary of Waco. There was a newsletter that came out from Lord Rees-Mogg in London with a false warning that the government was about to declare martial law, that Janet Reno was going to take away people's guns. They were going to have an assault on private militias, that the people would be disarmed. This is a newsletter from London to here, put out to the militia people. A man named John Rowland, the same day, March 22nd, 95, warned the news media, he sent this out to the newspapers, and the militias that crowded public places were going to be bombed, and the bombings blamed on militia leaders. That's his words. This Rowland is a former Air Force officer and a globalist, world federalist, told me in an interview that his information on this bombing and all of his other information comes from intelligence agent contacts set up for him by the British writer Ambrose Evans Pritchard. That's where his information came from, through that Pritchard to these intelligence agencies. 4 weeks after these warnings were given by these gentlemen, the Oklahoma City Federal Building was blown up by terrorists and 168 people were killed. Now, this guy Rowland personally started the militia movement in Texas. He organized the Texas Constitutional Militia the year before the Oklahoma City bombing. So the British were prophets of this bombing. And they were pumping up the militia. They were pumping up the populists. Out in Texas, March 25th, right after this warning, just before the Oklahoma City bombing, the militia turned out to a rally to see if they would be slaughtered like Rees-Mogg said they would be by the federal government. Nothing happened, but they were being pumped and pumped and pumped. Now, last April of this year, there was a siege in southwest Texas. Do you remember that? It was the Republic of Texas separatist groups, completely deluded individuals, completely separate from all reality, historical and present. And they were threatening to repeat the Waco slaughter on a much larger scale. They were asking for reinforcements to come from around the country armed to join them in a big, huge shootout with the federal government. We intervened in that, and we found out, first of all, these people, the ones there, believe the world's about to end by God's judgment. So what's the difference? And that they're being led to hate their own country by being pumped up with anti-government lies against the United States government. So what we did is we found out the background of the chief provocateur, a guy who called himself White Eagle, that he was actually, after our investigation, we found that he was trained by an Air Force officer who was a New Age guru and who went around the world with British intelligence people like Gregory Bateson of MKUltra. We put this story out about this provocateur. We got it out to the militias and to the separatists themselves. So that what happened in this siege was it was discredited. People did not come and make this a big blow-up. It failed. That is, they gave up. You might have seen the end result in the newspaper. But reports came into us, and they continue to come into us. Many of you hear these reports and pass them along to us in Leesburg, of provocations, that people are being pumped up for civil war. They're being told that a civil war is inevitable. using lies, pumping fear into people. The government is going to attack you. The government is going to enslave you. Washington is going to enslave you. You must arm against the United States, they're being told. One of the most persistent in this subversion is a man named Jim Ammerman. Now, you're going to hear right now in a second a tape, an audio tape made by him where he's talking about, first about Armageddon. The end of the world is about to happen and he's ready for it. And then he's going to say that the people are getting armed, the government is arming against the people, and we may have to have a civil war, but he's for it if it's necessary. He says that he is going out to mediate between the militias and the FBI, and he's got people on both sides of it. Play the audio.
Real close, and I'm ready for it, and I want it. I read the Bible through when I was 13 in 90 days that summer.
Hear that?
And ever since then, I've said, Lord, let me live until you return. I want to be there for that glorious rapture experience.
Turn it up.
And now, I know there's going to be a few tough things happen just before then. I said, I don't care how tough it gets, I still want to be there. Now, at this point, the best thing I can say about America's situation is that many people in America, citizens, good, honest, upright citizens, and many of them sold-out Christians, are arming themselves against our own government. Back and forth across this nation, it's happening. And the other side of the story is our government is arming itself and preparing special units against our own citizens. Now, that's the calmest thing I can say to you this morning, because it's worse than that, really. And these people are saying, I had a man call me, I'm meeting with some leaders of militia, and this is the only militiaman that I know by name and could identify. I've met a lot of them, and a lot of them have talked to me. I make sure I can't identify them, and I don't know their name, but for their protection and mine. And then I can say, I don't know any militia. But I'll tell you what, they're in a protective mode to protect and conserve what God gave us in this great nation. But here's what they're saying, and I'm to meet with 8 of them down in Central Texas and with 5 FBI leaders next Saturday. We're going to have an all-day meeting. And I've been saying, God, let us begin to communicate and tell the story that needs to be told so that the officials up the line will understand the people. Because our leaders in Washington, they don't understand us. I don't think they care. But they don't know and understand, and I'm going to do what I can to communicate. Because I'd rather have a battle of words than a battle of bullets. I've lived through 3 wars, and I'd just soon not have another one now that I'm up in my 70s. But if I have to, I will.
Now, this man is a retired military officer, colonel. He was a chaplain in the armed forces and special forces and some other things. But he now controls 200 chaplains in the armed forces, in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines throughout the world, also inside the FBI and in prisons throughout the country. He's the head of a network of chaplains. He controls their paychecks. If he says to the government, this man doesn't represent our group, they have to fire him. His bulletins and faxes and audio and videotapes are being pushed onto separatists and militias all over the country. Everybody in the Republic of Texas group dotes on this. And I talked to an awful lot of them about this. Now we're going to see a video. And you're going to see him warning his militia viewers, that's who's watching these things, and separatist viewers about the imminent military takeover of the United States. He warns that the military is training to seize the cities and put the people under slavery. Maybe dim the lights. Dim the lights, please.
Welcome to the Prophecy Club, where we study and research Bible prophecy. Our topic tonight is the imminent military takeover of the USA 2. This will be the second video that we make of Jim Ammerman. Now, we prophecy students look at the Bible and we say, wow, some of this seems to be coming to pass. We look at the newsletter and say, there's some more of it coming to pass. But we're basically blessed to hear tonight some additional information that you'll never hear, you'll never see in the newspaper or on TV. Now, our speaker tonight is uniquely qualified to talk on it. He has 26 years in the military. He was the head military chaplain for the Army, and he is now retired. He is former Green Beret, CIA, and has a top secret security clearance. Will you help me welcome Jim Ammerman?
Training as a part of the multi-jurisdictional task force, and that main training is at Fort Polk, Louisiana, where they just built a $20 million city to train in. It's only the outside of the buildings. I went down there. I get there fairly often. I have a granddaughter that's an Army doctor there, and I have some chaplains assigned there. So I have an official reason to go down there, a logical reason. And I said, why do we have a city like this? Oh, this is in case we train so that in case we need to go over to Africa like Somalia again. Somalia doesn't have any cities like ours. That's not what they're training for. They're training how to take you out of your home, out of your office and all. Before they moved to Fort Polk, they trained at Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, just east of Fort Smith, Arkansas. And it still has its moat training facility, as does every major ground training, both Army and Marine. That's infantry, ground forces. To control terrain, to control people, you must have ground forces. You can kill them from the air, you can sink their ships, but to control people and to control landmass, you must have ground forces. There's no other way to do it. And so all of them are being trained. I have in my files, I can't carry it all around.
Military lingo,
I'd have to have an 18-wheeler to haul the stuff around. But I have the 6-page questionnaire. You've heard about that was given about 3 years ago at 29 Palms Infantry Training Center for the Marines out in the desert, the Mojave Desert. And some Marines there, you know, it's pretty tough to control all Americans. And some of those young Marines got an extra copy and brought it out. And then they published it. And so I got a copy of it, the full thing. And it started out very innocuous. Your name, rank, serial number, where you were born, and all these things that, you know, people in the service have been asked many times. But you get down to the last question and it said, if America chooses to disarm its citizens and they refused, would you shoot American civilians? And they were supposed to answer yes or no. And some answered yes. Would you believe they were put in a special detachment for special training and were given a United Nations ID card when they finished the training? That's pretty serious stuff, isn't it? They were placed under United Nations control because they would shoot civilians.
Now, later in this tape, he says to the loud applause of this Prophecy Club audience that Jane Fonda should have been executed publicly. Oh, rah, rah! Because people are angry. They're angry what happened in the Vietnam War. They're angry about the government. Right after they're applauding, while they got their blood up, he says, and right behind her, they should have executed Bill Clinton. And they're quiet. Are we applauding for that too? I'm not sure, right? And he, in many of his tapes and discussions, he says that Clinton has killed dozens or hundreds of people and deserves the punishment that is obvious for that. That he has committed crimes of immense magnitude to cover up his murders. Now, he was down there in Texas working in that siege, as I was from Leesburg. In other words, he was down there mediating from the separatists to the FBI. He was the intermediary. A guy pumping people up to attack and overthrow the government and assassinate the president. Okay, now, populists get this kind of material. What do we mean by populists today? All right, first slide. Here's an ad that is in a magazine called the Barnes Review that goes out to populists in America. It's published by Willis Carto, publisher of Spotlight magazine. This is an ad for a book called Friedrich Nietzsche, written by the Nazi propagandist Alfred Rosenberg. And it describes Nietzsche as a social populist. This is an open Nazi magazine. Next. This is an ad for I guess it's a video, a tape, an audio tape or something, battle songs and marches of the German armed forces in World War II. You can buy this if you send money to the NS Publications. The Aryan nations and Ku Klux Klan and Christian identity movements are being pumped up with this type of material, with a whole cross-section of precisely what Ammerman is getting out. Now, these movements, as we have demonstrated, as we demonstrated to the police authorities in Europe, are riddled by and are run by professional provocateurs, professional intelligence agents. There is no indigenous movement of that sort. And we have discredited and wrecked several of the leaders of these things, including Gary Lauck, who is a British intelligence agent who is now in jail in Germany. So these people are aiming for race war, separatism, and disintegration of the United States. Now, Ammerman is a clergyman. What kind of a clergyman is he? Well, he's called Pentecostal or charismatic. His chaplaincy is called, so you can make a record of this, the Full Gospel Chaplaincy. That's a denomination that he made up with his backers. So what do we mean by that? Well, he speaks in tongues. That is, he speaks nonsense words or syllables, and this is to take the place of prayer. He claims to have supernatural powers. He claims to have power of prophecy. In one instance, a guy came up to the stage in pain, and Ammerman said that God told me that 12 years ago you were in an auto accident and injured your left shoulder. God didn't tell him that. It's like some of the Masonic insurance companies used to have people out there who told them personal things about the people so they could cancel their life insurance. So we investigated. This is a pretty startling case of a man who's pumping people up for civil war, and he's running chaplains in a confidential relationship to servicemen all over the world. How is he protected? How does he get away with this? So when he says on his speeches that his chaplains in the armed forces tell him about the movements of American armed forces so that he can alert people to counteract them. So how does he get away with that if he is officially running these things in the military? Well, we have a network of retired and active duty people in the military. We call them followers of Toffler, third wave, new age futurists. And they are also, at the same time, the same people, end times freaks. They're in the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Air Force, the Special Forces, active duty, retired, and reserves. I'm not talking about all military people, quite the contrary. I'm talking about people who have a lot of power and who are very dangerous. Ammerman told me in an interview that when the showdown comes between the government and the people, quote, there is a network of colonels and above throughout the military who would stand by the Constitution and against the president. They know who they are, and they are in close communication with each other. They could control the country if they need to. We found that there is a globalist corruption within the military. This man, Ammerman, and many others like him that you hear about, warn about globalists. But it is those globalists who created Ammerman's organization, who put him up to his treason. He talks about foreign troops on American soil. How many people have heard that story? There's foreign troops here. There's foreigners in America. Did you know that? Now, what does he mean by foreign troops? Well, he says particularly German troops. And he pumps this thing up about German troops in America. And then he slips in the word after he's repeated about a German soldier in Dulles Airport, a German soldier down in Texas. He says enemy troops. He substitutes the word enemy for foreign. That's called a demagogue. The British are not foreign in his lexicon. They are his guides. Now, there was a fight in the Pentagon about this matter of allowing this abomination to exist within our military. When his group applied for the permission to have him be the endorser for these chaplains in 1983, there was a fight that took 13 months. And unfortunately, well, the traditionalists fought against this, but this was the era of George Bush, vice president, running covert operations, with Oliver North working for him, who is one of these Pentecostalists. They had a fight, and this was put through after 13 months. Now, this is the foreign operation in the United States. This is a British underground network that goes through the military, through Pentecostalism, and through the militias. The British globalists who set up his chaplaincy created the Pentecostal movement. They seek to reduce Americans to mindlessness, to the conception of lower animals. We have to demonstrate that. You'll see that. I think you can reflect about that to begin with. Think about the fact that the British Empire, the Anglicans, the high church, the people in suits and very conservative bankers of that sort, high aristocrats, the lords of the earth, who look down on the people who take up their manipulated faiths, their manipulated movements. They have gathered themselves low church subjects in the United States and throughout the world. Next. Okay, now, this is 1968. And the man pictured here, General Ralph Haynes, is the man who commissioned this Ammerman chaplaincy to be set up. He asked Ammerman to set this up. This Washington Post article pictures General Haynes when he was running the United States Army, all Army troops within the continental United States. He was in charge of all the counterinsurgency and intelligence operations underneath him and deploying them, moving his troops into Detroit and Washington, D.C. to counter riots before and after the Martin Luther King assassination. If you think the military or somebody connected to the military might have had something to do with the assassinations or the riots, ask him about it. He told the media that there was a plan that he was activating that he called Operation Garden Plot, which was for the military to link up with local police departments and state governments and with the FBI to take over all cities in the United States, for the military to move into them and take them over. And he used the counterintelligence files of the military on the dissidents that might be active in all the cities. This is what he told me. So he made headlines there, but he faded away. Ammerman warns about a military takeover of the United States. And this is the man who asked him to set up his organization and who's on his board and lectures to his chaplains right now. Next slide. How did Haynes go from counterinsurgency to this insurgency against the United States? Well, this is a New York Times little tiny article, 1973, years later, when Haynes retired from the U.S. Army. He told me in an interview about his fateful experience in 1971. General Haynes went to a meeting of a Masonic-like organization called the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship. I'm sure some of you in the audience have heard about that. The meeting was run by a British intelligence asset, a professional brainwasher named Harold Bredesen. Haynes told me that the businessmen there were speaking out and tears were running down their cheeks. He said, "I was getting very uncomfortable. I signaled to my aide, 'Let's get going, let's get out of here.' But Harold leaned over to me. He said, 'Are you charismatic?' I thought it over. I answered, 'I don't think so.' 'Well, what did charismatic mean?' Harold was the speaker. People were putting up their hands in uncontrolled fervor. I put my hands up a little bit, the discreet Episcopal level. People asked me, 'General, what's your problem? Why only half-mast?' After Harold gave his talk, there was renewed praising of the Lord. My hands crept up to fully extended. I felt things happening to me. I felt things beyond my comprehension. It was not elation. I was dazed by it. Everyone crowded around me. They could all see something was happening. People closed in on me. I got out. I went to my room. I wanted to be alone. Harold came and ministered to me. The next day I saw that the speech I was to deliver to them was pabulum. What would satisfy these people? The people were saying, 'The general got zapped last night.' So, though I used the core of what I had prepared, I now spoke differently, tailoring it to what had happened. I then thought, I don't know what God wants of me, but I'm ready to do what he says. Next. A few days after he retired from the active duty, he starts a new career. He went to this meeting in Dallas, 73, to organize and supervise the Pentecostal element in the Episcopal Church, along with some world agents of that organization. Next, 1978, Haynes went to England for this Anglican meeting and other strategy sessions in England. And I'm learning more about what was going on then. The objective, this was in the Lambeth Palace, or Canterbury Cathedral. I guess this would be in the cathedral. But the idea of these meetings was to set up a worldwide drive to spread Pentecostalism, to spread this lunacy of his, what he was inducted into. I'm not speaking now about what Pentecostalism is. I'll get to that in a minute. But what he went through, he was now being induced to spread around the world under the guidance of the Queen of England's church. And he met with the top leaders of that church and was working in strategy sessions with them to spread it around the world. Now, it was at that point that Ammerman was asked by Haynes to set up this organization that we just mentioned, this chaplain's operation. And we're going to get back to the origin of Pentecostalism. To get into the game, get deeper into this to see what's the game they're playing. There's something called the British Israel mythology. And this underlies much of the popular, hold a second, much of the popular delusion of the United States citizens in religion as well as politics. It is eminently Masonic because it was a theory of what happened in the world that had been crafted by earlier generations in England, but it was perfected in the mid-19th century by the British government, British Foreign Office, Queen Victoria, Foreign Ministry, and so forth. Put this on here now. This is the story the British Israel myth of the British Empire, that the ancient Israelites left Palestine and migrated, in this map by the lines that they show, from Palestine to Britain. And how silly this is, you can tell by the fact that at first they said, and that makes Britain the chosen people of God. How silly it is that the original story was that these chosen people wandered to Germany as well, and the Nordic peoples as a whole were the chosen people. But in the 1870s, Germany broke with Britain's policy on free trade. So they cut them out of the story, and they said, our archaeologists have just found out that Syria moved up there, and they're the ancient Assyrians, so Germany is satanic, and Russia is Gog of the Bible. Now, what follows from this is that Queen Victoria is not the whore of Babylon. After all, she is descended from King David, which makes her a blood relative of Jesus Christ. If you want to figure out how that works with the Virgin Mary, don't bother. But this also means, most emphatically, that the British Empire is of God and that America made a mistake in its revolution, because they're the blood brothers of the chosen people. They should give it up, rejoin the empire. Next. So at the time of the turn of the century, when Pentecostalism was born, the aims of British Israelism were very explicit. Here is a British Israel pamphlet entitled The Anglo-American Alliance in Prophecy, or the Promises to the Fathers. Remember, why the pyramid, which they managed to get on American seal? Well, why the pyramid? What is that about? Well, they claim that you can look inside a pyramid for clues to what the Christian Bible means. So it comes from the fact that the Masons were commissioned by the British royal family to go to Palestine and dig underneath Jerusalem to find secrets, and then to reinterpret the Bible according to secrets found by the British Army. So this idea, where they say that the Americans should give up their independence, rejoin the British Empire, underlies both Pentecostalism and the Christian identity movement, which is an offshoot of this movement. You have to understand one additional element, and that is that the Jews become a commodity in the marketplace here. And there's two uses for them. One use is that they're sent back to Palestine. I guess they're an extra tribe that is wandering around, surplus, and they need to be sent back to set up a Zionist state there and bring about a war with the Muslims and the end of the world. That's for some people. And then another way of using this extra people is to exterminate them. And this is in the Christian identity movement, both of them explicitly from British Israelism. Next. If you study Pentecostal religion in the history books, such as they are, you will find that this gentleman is the initiator of Pentecostalism. He is named Charles F. Parham. He is a preacher in Kansas. In 1901, people started speaking in tongues in his church. Spread from there. Now, he was a British Israel fanatic. He had been trained for about a year in the British Israel cult. He had gone to Maine to join a cult up there and be trained there. He toured Canada, and he was a race fanatic of the British Israel cult. And he initiated the method of speaking in tongues in America. Next. Here is the gavel that Mr. Parham brought back from Palestine and donated to the Masons, his Masonic lodge in Kansas. Next. On the right, you see a black preacher named William J. Seymour, who took the message of speaking in tongues from this incredible phenomena of this race fanatic down in Kansas who was going around the country spreading this. He took this to California, which became a big base for this, and he had a revival on Azusa Street in California in 1906. The funny thing about this is that when he was learning from Parham, he wasn't allowed to sit in the hall. He had to sit either outside in the hallway or out the window, because the guy starting this speaking in tongues was such a race fanatic, racist. You see on the left there, snake handling. This is from a dictionary of charismatic activities. This was an experiment on American blacks to see what could be done in the new era of Jim Crow laws and Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. The origin of Pentecostalism tended to fade from view when Charles Parham was arrested for sodomizing one of his followers. His career was destroyed, and he went on to become a stump speaker for the Ku Klux Klan. But Pentecostalism, minus its founder, was established in things like the Assemblies of God and other churches, but it was feared as either satanic or fake by mainline Protestant and Catholic churches. Now, the British, taking this experiment among American blacks to their newly conquered South Africa, in 1908, they had just beaten the Boers, the Dutch settlers, in a war, and they had to subdue the Zulus. They had a war with the Zulus there, blacks, or part of the blacks, and so they brought in Pentecostalism. They had observers in the United States who went to South Africa and under the British rule worked on the Zulus and had them falling on the stage, on the altar, in heaps, fainting, hypnotized, moaning, jerking around, screaming, speaking in tongues. Cecil Rhodes, the race strategist down there in South Africa, told the Pentecostalists, this was called the Apostolic Faith Mission, that you have done more to subdue the Zulus than any military could have done. Now, Cecil Rhodes and Milner, the governor, the British governor in South Africa, and a group connected with them set up the Round Table, the British race strategists who, with Rhodes' idea of spreading a white racialist empire around the world and including getting back the United States, eventually setting up the Council on Foreign Relations. This was the British colonial apparatus in Africa experimenting on how to increase an empire, how to destroy the minds and the spirits of the people there. One of the spin-offs from the British missionary and colonial apparatus was called the World Council of Churches. This was started in 1937 in England, and it was organized as a spin-off of the International Missionary Council of the British Empire. A guy named Oldham was the head of that, and then he sat down with Curtis and Lord Lothian, and they planned this conference to set up the World Council of Churches as a British Empire apparatus. These are the bishops at the founding conference in 1937. Now, the British were getting ready to launch a new round of Pentecostalism in the United States, and they called this the Charismatic Renewal. Next. So, this man, if you look it up again in the history books, such as they are, you will see his name is David du Plessis, and he was a South African, British subject. He was the head of that church that subdued the Zulus, called the Apostolic Faith Mission. He became known as Mr. Pentecost in the world because under the British government, he went out throughout the world, and particularly in America, and rammed this through to get this set up again, to get this credited as something worthwhile. How did this work? Mr. du Plessis was adopted by the World Council of Churches, executive, who took him around to the Protestant churches and to the Catholic churches in the Vatican, and took him around to Yale and Harvard and told the people in America, in the old days you thought that Pentecostalism was either satanic or fake. It was a clown show. Well, now, we authorities, we Anglicans, we World Council of Churches authorities assure you that this is now the era for Pentecostalism to be respected. It's not a freak show. It's not satanic. We give it credentials. And that's the way this thing was worked. Mr. Duplessis set up this full gospel businessmen's fellowship with Oral Roberts and a little clique of people. A guy named Shakarian was a front man for that. They have a central group now that is actually headquartered at Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that is in charge of spreading this abomination throughout the world. It involves Ammerman, Oral Roberts, a guy named Benny Hinn, Ken Copeland, Stephen Strang, and some other people. Next. Now, keeping in mind that Mr. Duplessis was traveling on a British passport, that he called for UN rule throughout the world because he worked with the UN as well as the World Council of Churches. Here's another member of this central clique, Harold Bredesen. Remember his name? He was the guy at that meeting where General Haynes got zapped. That's Harold. He was trained by, as he wrote, a very strange organization called the International Christian Leadership Group. It was started in Washington during World War II by the British Air Attaché. That's the British intelligence guy in the British Air Force office in Washington. Started this so-called Christian group. Then it was taken over by, in Britain, by a guy who was in the British Admiralty and the Archbishop of Canterbury's office simultaneously. Next. But this organization actually then became sponsored officially and had its conferences in the royal palaces of the Dutch monarchy. It was sponsored by the Dutch royal family. These are the people who are training these brainwashers. Now, it's very interesting if you hear somebody saying that they're against the globalists or they're against the establishment. Here is a faith that was actually put up by people who may feel themselves to be conservatives against liberalism, right? This series of conferences organizing this leadership group that zapped General Haynes and eventually brought in Pat Robertson. This leadership group was formed by these two individuals and their friend, their immediate family, the Queen, the Prince Bernard and Queen Juliana, at the same time as they were setting up the Bilderbergers group in the same place and the World Wildlife Fund with Prince Philip. Next. Oh, wait, hold on. Keep that here. There's a Dutch, famous, she was a scandal. She was a faith healer that was a totally insane woman attached to the royal family of Holland. Because these people are as nuts as what they try to impose on other people. They're completely insane. Just because they're rich and powerful doesn't mean they're not totally insane. Next. Dr. Vereda up there, and these are extremely rare photographs. The guy up in the upper left with Princess Wilhelmina was the man who trained Bredesen. And there she is with Queen Juliana. Next. Now, Pentecostalism really took off in the 1960s. This is a headline from the San Francisco Chronicle about the dispute that broke out about Pentecostalism. Where did the dispute break out? Well, in the Episcopal Church. Because, remember, the Episcopal Church is affiliated with the Anglican Church. It officially split off in the American Revolution. But guess what? A lot of people weren't part of that program. They're called Tories or traitors. And this church as an arm of the Anglican Church, again, was used to launch Pentecostalism in the United States. It was an Englishman named Bennett, who was out there in Van Nuys, California, in an Episcopal church, who announced in 1960 to his congregation, "Oh, I have started speaking in tongues." And this was put in Time magazine, Newsweek magazine, and there was a big fight in the church. The official doctrine was defended by Bishop Pike in California. So that's how it was spread. But next, it wasn't just some sort of publicity because people were interested in the story. There was a central organ, a magazine, a central organization for spreading this everywhere. It was called the Blessed Trinity Society. This was their magazine. Very, very rare. Only exists in a few archives. Next. The board of this magazine was David Duplessis, the British intelligence agent on the right, and the chairman of the board, Harold, the Anglo-Dutch intelligence officer. There's a woman down here, Jean Stone, the second line there. She was the editor, and her husband was a very wealthy Lockheed aircraft director who was a ferocious Anglican loyalist. In other words, loyal to England, and a former Navy officer. And what they did is they intervened, they mediated with rich Americans who could be counted on to back anything that Britain wanted to do in America. So they spread Pentecostalism and speaking in tongues among the lower orders of Americans, not rich people. It started with this set, but it was spread by them to these poor lower orders of people. And they told in Trinity magazine how this charismatic renewal was spread in conjunction with the mother church in England. That they tell this story back and forth. Now, how did the British strategists view what they were doing to the Americans? How did they think about this? Well, I'm going to show you a book. Jeff mentioned this. It has, put it on. This is the cover of the book. It's called The Battle for the Mind. And on the cover, right above that, you might be able to read The Mechanics of Indoctrination, Brainwashing, and Thought Control. This book was published in 1957 when they were gearing this thing up. Dr. William Sargent was a psychiatrist with the Tavistock Institute, and probably more important for your consideration, he has a career on the staff of Maudsley Hospital in England, which is the British Center for what is known as eugenic psychiatry or psychiatric eugenics. This was the methodology and the pretext for starting the T4 organization under Adolf Hitler, and it was managed by the British, by this group of people who spread Pentecostalism into the United States. The United States military began thinking along the lines of needing indoctrination, brainwashing, and thought control, at least a current among them, a very important current, after Douglas MacArthur was fired. We need mind war. We don't need nations that produce steel. We need terror bombing. We need psychological warfare. We need computer games. Next, this is from the book. Here you see people being put into voodoo trances and possession. You have 3 photographs here of pagans, quote, pagans, unquote. The bottom, you see people in Bali. He says, technique used in Bali makes worshippers believe they are possessed by the spirits of monkeys. Now, Harold Bredesen writes in a recent article in Charisma magazine, remember, this is the magician preacher that captured Haynes and who trained Pat Robertson. Bredesen says the way demons operate. Unclean spirits come into a medium, violate her personality, and speak through her. But rest assured that what we're doing is different. The Holy Spirit doesn't want mediums, robots, or zombies. He instructs you how to speak in tongues. Don't speak words your mind understands. As long as you do, your mind will remain in control. Next. Same book. Now we got Christians. The last one was pagans. Now we have, quote, Christians, unquote. It's being studied by the British psychiatrists. While they're doing this, while they're making this thing up for Americans to follow. Terminal exhaustion, states of acute excitement leading to the final phase of total collapse are purposefully worked for in potential converts during religious snake handling. Next. This is a blow-up. All phenomena are explained as the work of the Holy Ghost. Next. Similar effects being produced in a non-religious setting in Great Britain by the use of rhythmic drumming and dancing in the recent craze for, quote, rock and roll, unquote. They hadn't yet exported it here. Next. This is a later book by the same author. When they had exported it, and this shows it's the same subject, and it says beetle possession. Now remember, Bredesen goes to Pat Robertson, the son of a member of the Churchill family. His mother's a Churchill. Very proud of that. Winston Churchill's family. His father is a Wall Street and London stooge, head of the banking committee in the United States Senate. And Bredesen goes to young Pat Robertson and gets him as an operative in this initiative. I'm not talking about a religion. In this initiative, this little group. Now, how did you have this tolerated in our country? What's going on? When a British political asset can do this kind of thing. Next. Here is, going back to that Dallas meeting in 1973, this is a pamphlet that they put out from the meeting. Again, a very rare item. It shows General Ralph Haynes up there and David du Plessis. And they're both speaking at this meeting. And note the topics that they're speaking on. General Haynes is speaking on the starving souls of hollow men. And David du Plessis says the Holy Spirit is a ghost no longer. Read Schiller's Ghost Seer about this sort of thing. Haynes is in his new career working alongside of mercenaries, working alongside of former military, active military, and British private armies all over the world. He goes to London from this meeting, and he gets plugged into Anglican worldwide operations and British Empire worldwide operations, as you've heard described here on this stage today. Now, I spoke to the guy that drove him around England just a couple of days ago. And he is the head of an organization, a British so-called Christian organization called the Officers Christian Union. And if you're from any country in the world, listen up, because this British organization has penetrated your military. Next. The branch in the United States of this organization is called the Officers Christian Fellowship. Pray, discover, obey. It was founded in 1943 as a U.S. branch of this British global organization. In their own history, they say that their group was founded in 1851 in India. Remember, this is an American military officers group. Our group was founded in 1851 in India, where as Rudyard Kipling wrote, there was the white man's burden and so on and so forth. The head of this whole organization worldwide is the governor of the Isle of Man, and former deputy chief of staff of England. They had a meeting, a worldwide meeting in 1994 in Norfolk, Virginia Beach, where 90 countries got together to discuss how the militaries were going to be penetrated by this organization. Next. One of the chief speakers for this organization is former Colonel Oliver North. Here he's shown testifying during the Iran-Contra hearings. One of the men who writes in the history book of this group is General Graves, the current superintendent of West Point. I believe he's the current superintendent. He was superintendent when this book came out a couple of years ago. This extends into Mexico. It's very active in the Mexican military. In South America, it's very active in the Russian military. The guy running this on a day-to-day basis, Major Fillingham, said to me, well, you know, we've chosen an intermediate organization with a very ambiguous title. And he rattled off several words in a title of a group that they control. He said, well, we need this intermediary because it's very sensitive. You see, in the third world, they'll think that this is MI5 or CIA or something like that. Next. How'd they get this started in America? Something as awful as that. Well, it was started by this man. This is really a rare photograph. Hayes Kroner, a U.S. Army general, who was the head of military intelligence in the War Department during World War II. Not OSS, but one of Stimson's people. Now, I last saw his name in Who's Who in 1946. I said, what happened to the guy? I can't find him. He disappears from the historical record. Finally solved the mystery. He changed his name. He became, instead of the Georgia-born Hayes Kroner, he adopted a British accent, and he became Hayes Kroner Ashby de Grey. And he moved to England and died in England in the 1970s. And I was talking to Linda de Hoyos about this form of pathetic corruption of the mind. Why would Americans do something like this? To worship England or the British in this fashion? She said, well, remember that they're not worshiping the English people. They don't want to talk like Cockney in the street. They don't like that type of people. They yearn to be higher aristocrats, the lords of the earth, who are more respectable than Americans. So if you hear somebody on the telephone and he rants and screams about they don't care about some other countries, you ever hear somebody talk like that? I just care about America. I want the foreigners out of America. You got a big job to do, don't you? Get the foreigners out of America. How about the British? How about the people that have imposed their will on this country, including your mind? Why don't you stop playing the stooge for the only foreigners who are an important threat to our country? Now, there's a little secret intelligence organization of Jim Ammerman, operating principally in Texas and some other places. It's called the Mount Rushmore Foundation. And he's the chaplain for it and the strategist. And one of their leaders is a guy named General Ben Parton. You might have heard of him. He's made a name for himself, a nuclear weapons specialist and explosives man, former retired military. He's been put on the media a lot for saying, naturally, reasonably enough, that McVeigh could not have blown up Oklahoma City building by himself. But what is not put on the media very much is his general ideas of Parton. Parton believes the U.S. government is essentially a communist government. He has subscribed since the 1940s to the British Israelite publication of Kenneth de Courcy's writings. And he is a fanatic Anglophile to the point of literal insanity. Parton is the founder, along with a guy down in South Africa, of a group, and he's on the board, called the Frontline Fellowship. And they are at war in Africa. They are actually carrying out armed conflict all over Africa. The so-called missionaries in this group, as he described it to me, are former scouts of the South African Army. The leader of it, Peter Hammond, the African leader, Peter Hammond, is a former officer in South African government, supposedly. But this organization, as we know, is part of a group of military and other organizations putting siege to Sudan and Nigeria, Kenya, and having just carried out this genocide. This is a book they put out. This guy Parton, Ammerman's partner, put out about Sudan. And chapter 3, imagine an American general having this view of history. Chapter 3 is about a homosexual drunk who helped kill 20 million Chinese and then tried to conquer Sudan, named Chinese Gordon. British Empire general, mass genocidalist, lunatic who was finally stopped by the Sudanese when they won their independence. He is put forward as the model Christian for the entire world to follow, as particular Americans. Part of this book explains why he is not a pederast and a homosexual and a drunk. Next. Now, at this point, we have to get into the heavy artillery. You know what a vampire is? This is garlic. Stops the vampires. You need this in Norfolk because you have a guy down there named Pat Robertson. This is a flyer put out by Pat Robertson's organization. He's being endorsed by former President George Bush for his work, particularly in Africa. Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network was set up by Harold Bredesen, who was the chairman of that organization, and the money for it was raised by the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship in their Masonic activities all over the world for the British Empire. That's the history of it. Pat Robertson tried to back out of it. He was put back into action by Bredesen and the Full Gospel people. Same thing, Ammerman tried to back out of his thing. General Haynes put him back into it. Now, let me move on here to the last slide, and we will see Caroline Cox. The high priestess of the Pentecostal faith in America is a British baroness who is conducting satanic warfare against the African people in person. And she is called a saint in the August issue of Charisma magazine, which is put out by the central, you can call it the Politburo of the Pentecostal faith. Now you're going to see now finally a video in which, hold on a second, in which Pat Robertson is going to justify the murder of 1 million human beings in Sudan by the war that was brought there by the British. And I want you to pay close attention to, you'll see an interchange here. This is religion now, remember, supposedly, right? You'll see an interchange, and then pay close attention to the end comments by Pat Robertson. Okay, put it on.
on these regimes that are so oppressive. Well, joining us now from our Washington bureau is the Baroness Carolyn Cox. Lady Cox is the Deputy Speaker of the British House of Lords and the UK President of Christian Solidarity International. She made 3 trips to prohibited areas in the southern Sudan this year. And Lady Cox, may I ask you, what did you find on those 3 trips to southern Sudan?
Well, good morning. We found one of the worst tragedies in the world today. The fundamentalist Islamic regime is carrying out a jihad, or a holy war as they call it, against the Africans of the south, many of whom are Christians, but also persecuting some of its own Muslim minorities in the north who dare to oppose it. And that tragedy is unimaginable proportions. Recent years, 1.5 million died, over 5 million displaced, and we believe tens of thousands of black Africans enslaved.
What are your thoughts on this peace agreement signed by the government and 4 of the rebel groups?
That's a propaganda issue. The so-called rebel groups who've signed that peace agreement have already been supporting that government. The real battle is between the fundamentalist regime, which is trying to impose its jihad against the African Christians and others in the country who oppose it, and those who are fighting for freedom and fighting to stop the spread of fundamentalist Islam throughout Sudan and further afield.
Should the free nations of the world, the UK or the United States, begin to help the rebel group that is still fighting? What action should we take?
Well, first of all, as Christians, I must bring a message from the Christian church there in Sudan. Their overriding plea is they feel they are forgotten by the international community, forgotten by international Christendom. When they're with them, they're dying of starvation, have no food, dying of disease, have no medicines because the government describes their areas as no-go areas to aid organizations. Their first request is always for prayer. They feel forgotten by Christendom, but they also need political support. And what the international community must be doing is putting pressure on that regime in Khartoum to open up all of Sudan to humanitarian aid, open up Sudan to human rights monitors, so that they can investigate the slavery which we know is going on, that they can investigate the peoples who are suffering at the hands of a brutal regime.
What is your feeling about the success of such an initiative if we do put pressure on them? Do you think we can succeed as the international community against Sudan?
Well, we've got to speak for truth and justice as Christians, and we can have an effect. But the effect must be focused. Those who are Christians do plead with us for help to enable them to survive against the attempts to exterminate them.
Lady Cox, thank you for your courage in this, and we wish you our prayers and best wishes in the work that you're doing to bring the attention of these forgotten people to the world community. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Terry?
Well, it's wonderful to see something happening in that arena.
We've got to do something, and somebody who is a key member of the British House of Lords can make something happen. We need members of the United States Congress doing the same thing. This is a very serious matter, and I know that if it's brought, spotlights put on it.
Yes.
Sudan is not all that powerful. They're I think you can say a rogue regime. I don't think they're exactly in favor with Egypt. I don't know who right now is supporting him, whether it's Muammar Gaddafi that may be sending some weapons to them. I was in Khartoum some time ago with George Bush when he was vice president. In that time, although they had just introduced what is called Sharia, it wasn't as extreme as this current military regime. The president was more or less benign, but there was a coup against him shortly after we were there, and so we've had successive dictatorial regimes, and it wouldn't be that hard for the international community to put pressure on Sudan. They owe a huge amount of money, and I think if there was a embargo, blockade, and if need be military force, I think they would come to heel very quickly.
They owe a lot of money, and if there was an embargo or military force if necessary, they could be brought to heel like dogs. Barking dogs is what Americans are being reduced to. You can find out about these churches where they are now taking this to the point where people literally bark like dogs and make other animal noises. One of them was a wolf. The congressman from this area who went up there to that church in Toronto, part of this little group, they have an airport facility in the Toronto airport where they bark like dogs under the name of Pentecostalism. Wolf, our congressman, went up there to pray, supposedly, to bark. Or like worms. Now, the central group that's running this initiative has set up one of their forefront operations is called the Promise Keepers. They're going to have a march or they hope for a million-man march. Hughes from New Jersey said that it might better be called a million worm squirm. Because they say part of their training is called worm training. One of their cult guides named Wellington Boone explained this in Charisma magazine. People have not yet learned how to become broken. We are called to be worms. A worm never protests. Can you say for Christ, I am a worm and am no man? Jesus was crushed like a worm. He was slapped. They spat in his face until it ran down his cheeks. God doesn't raise anything that is not dead. If we allow God to work into us the idea of worm training, it would be revolutionary. We'd gain a worm's eye view of what God wants. When we really meet Jesus and allow ourselves to be crushed, the impact will rock this world. Our revolution against the British Empire, our Declaration of Independence, have been the greatest inspiration of courage to men everywhere. In 1861, America was sliding towards civil war. Taking office as president, Abraham Lincoln asked Americans to be moved by the better angels of our nature to save the Union. The Union victory, the completion of our Constitution with civil rights, and Lincoln's nationalist economic leadership gave this country and the entire world a miraculous leap in inventiveness, power over nature, and optimism. We now ask our fellow men to hark to those better angels of Lincoln and to bury the evil spirits that have brought such devastation to our planet.